This is a Dutch testing report tutorial to assist you as you try to interpret your Dutch hormone testing results. These are for educational information only and not to be taken as any sort of medical advice. The results that we're showing on the screen are just example results, not from any particular patient. So as we're looking at the cortisol, there's a lot of data to look at. The data that we want to look at most primarily is the free cortisol pattern. That's kind of where we typically want to start. So in this particular case, we've got 4 measurements. So we've got a waking measurement, and remember, waking urine sample is a reflection of the night's overall free cortisol levels. Right? It's not a reflection of waking cortisol. It's the waking sample which reflects the overnight while you were sleeping cortisol. The next 2 hours, there should be typically a surge of cortisol in the morning, and so we want to capture that in that 2-hour sample. Typically those results will come down by afternoon and then are at their lowest at bedtime. So you want to evaluate your results relative to the expected pattern to not only look at whether the overall results are high or low, but also what the pattern itself is compared to the expected pattern. The overall levels of free cortisol can be approximated by looking at this marker here, which is just adding all of these up and is a good reflection of the total for free cortisol. Now, in this particular case, we're on the higher side of normal in terms of the free cortisol. So there's plenty of it, and we want to look again at that pattern. However, when we want to look at the overall production of cortisol, the free cortisol is not the place we want to look because the free cortisol is only 1% of the total. So yes, it's a good reflection of free bioavailable cortisol, but it's not a great reflection of overall production. Metabolized cortisol is really your better marker for total cortisol production, and in this case, it's on the lower side, which implies that even though the free cortisol is on the higher side, the overall production of cortisol is not that high. So let's look at some of the other markers as well. As cortisol is made, it's made by the adrenal gland in response to a signaling hormone from the brain called ACTH. It then circulates throughout the body not only as cortisol, which is the active form, but also as cortisone, the inactive form. So then, if as it's circulating, it's kind of going back and forth between cortisol and cortisone, as we evaluate the up and down pattern of cortisol, we also want to confirm with cortisone. So again, it's secondary, it's not the active form, but it's good to confirm what's going on with the cortisol pattern by looking additionally at that. So cortisol is circulating in either one of these forms. It goes back and forth between the two by an enzyme called 11-beta HSD, and then it is metabolized to cortisol and cortisone metabolites. And if you add all those up, we call that metabolized cortisol, which is your marker for total cortisol production. So in a case like this, the free cortisol is within the normal range, but it's relatively high, whereas the production of cortisol is actually relatively low. The implication there being that the metabolism of cortisol is maybe a little bit slow or sluggish. Right? If the cortisol is not being metabolized, it sort of backs up and increases that free cortisol. So when we see the opposite of that, increased cortisol clearance, oftentimes it's from obesity, excess thyroid, maybe excess exposure to elevated cortisol. In this particular case, it seems that we may have decreased cortisol clearance, which you'll sometimes see in low thyroid cases. If there's poor liver function, the liver's not able to clear that cortisol like it typically does. The next thing we want to look at is what about the balance between cortisol and cortisone. So cortisol is the active form, cortisone is the inactive form, and sometimes you can get too heavy of a deactivation from cortisol to cortisone. In that case, this marker here would be pointing in this direction because we have more cortisone metabolites. If it's pointing back in the other direction, then we'd have more cortisol metabolites. In this particular case, where it seems that maybe the cortisol clearance is a little bit sluggish, if the cortisol is pointed more in this direction, maybe even more reason to take a look at the thyroid function, because what the literature would suggest is that if you have low thyroid function, what you can get is the cortisol staying in its active form, not being readily deactivated, and also you get somewhat sluggish or lower cortisol clearance, which is kind of the look that we have in this particular case. So we want to piece the whole thing together for cortisol. Free cortisol over time, the total of production, and then any metabolic preference that there may be. So I hope that's been helpful. We have other educational information on our website, dutchtest.com, that you can check out. If you have questions on your results from the perspective of a patient, please do see your healthcare provider for those, and we thank you for testing with us.